listeners, and welcome to episode 2 of season 9 of the Airways podcast. I'm Rohan Anand, and I'm joined by my regular co-host Vinay Bhaskara and Helwing via Masar. Good to see you both again after a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Looking all nice and ready to dive into today's topics. Unfortunately, I couldn't find my Air Canada shirt that I wanted to wear, and Vinay always makes fun of me for wearing Air Canada. That will be one of our topics that we go into today. And then I also had like a yellow tank top that was very Spirit Airlines color, which will be our second topic for today. Another thing that Vinay likes to make fun of me about.
I mean, you do have a masterful collection of tank tops in my experience. I'm feeling a little left out because I'm the only one without an aviation themed hat. I'm rocking my Visa Cash App Red Bull Formula One hat that I picked up last year at a race. So I'm the odd man out. No airline gear anywhere on my body.
I got this because my nephew he's planning to go into the Air Force.
That's excellent. Well, good for your nephew.
He's got to go through flight school though. So.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us again. We are really excited to bring you this next episode from our season as we resume this fall. And we're just going to dive right into it with our first topic being on Air Canada and the strikes that took place over the weekend. So for those of you who may not be fully aware, essentially the Canadian Union of Public Employees, I think they're pronounced CUPE, which represented over 10,000 flight attendants for Air Canada, issued a 72-hour strike warning, and that in turn led to Air Canada responding by issuing a flight attendant lockout notice. So all flights on Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge were canceled starting August 16th, 2025, which was a Saturday. This was all over the news. I was very surprised by how much coverage it got. And then it looked like yesterday, we're recording on Wednesday, August 20th, yesterday being August 19th, a Tuesday, Air Canada announced it would restart operations following a mediated agreement overseen by a mutually agreed to mediator. Wow, Air Canada, the last one in the most recent of global airlines to form a strike. Did either of you see this coming?
I mean, I think no is like probably the fairest answer, right? Like Air Canada has seemed pretty stable, right? Canada's obviously a country that has, a long history of labor, let's say, right? It's not quite European in its level of sort of labor volatility, but definitely, unions have more sort of power to act than they do in the United States. But I think the thing that's kind of interesting, right, is Air Canada is obviously a privatized airline, right? It's traded on public markets. It's owned by public shareholders, but it's also still sort of a national flag carrier and a national champion in a way, right? Like close to 50% of the Canadian air travel market is controlled by Air Canada, right? So in that sense, it's actually closer to something like, Singapore Airlines or Thai, right? Where it is the dominant player in that country and in that country's air travel market. And so what we've seen historically, right, is that when you are not in continental Europe or in the United States, this type of labor action that is incredibly disruptive to the operation, that is incredibly disruptive to the brand, setting aside, the sort of grievances or the challenges or the concerns that the Air Canada flight attendants had with their contract. We can definitely get into all of that. It's interesting to me that this was allowed to happen and that it persisted for as long as it did at a national champion, not a flag carrier, but flag carrier airline, if that makes sense. And so that's why my initial reaction was, I actually don't know if I would have expected this to actually play out and happen at Air Canada, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking more than 3,000 canceled flights, 1,500 domestic and 1,600 international.
And I think it underscores too that in the busy summer travel period, Air Canada transports a lot of US customers over its hubs in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto to Asia Pacific and to Latin America and to South Pacific and to Asia. So a lot of US residents were affected. Separate, not related from the tariffs and kind of how Air Canada and Canadian Airlines have adjusted capacity on the transborder market. Nevertheless, it is something that I think has impacted a lot of the travelers that were anticipating using Air Canada services over their hubs, as well as some of their joint venture partners like Lufthansa and United Airlines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important piece of it, right? Is like, as we've seen with airlines, this type of meltdown is the wrong word because it's obviously triggered by a different set of conditions than like the Delta CrowdStrike situation or the Southwest rolling blackout operational situation, a couple of winters ago. But this type of disruption to people's travel plans, particularly in the summer, right, when it's people who have built up maybe the entire year, maybe they saved up the entire year to go on vacation to Europe or to Asia or to Mexico, and their travel plans are now disrupted, maybe even their vacations canceled as a result of something that would appear to be within the airline's control. That has a meaningful impact on brand, and that has a meaningful impact in some ways on the economy. And so, like, that's actually the case that the Canadian government made to the labor court, right? When they came down on the flight attendants, they're like, nope, you guys are going into arbitration. Like, that case was downstream of, this is really, really impactful on the first order, right? Thousands, maybe even millions of passengers are being impacted in one way or the other. There's second order effects. It's going to take Air Canada a few days to get operations back to normal, to get planes into the right places, to restart operations, right? You can't just like freeze an airline network in place and then immediately get it back to where it needs to be 48, 72, 100, 96 or 120 hours later, right? Planes that should be in Montreal might be in Paris, or planes that should be in Toronto might be in Vancouver or Edmonton, right? So on some level, there's lasting sort of impact where this is not done from in terms of its impact on passengers and on travelers. And beyond that, there's going to be some portion of travelers who are impacted by this that are either never going to book Air Canada again, or are going to think twice about booking Air Canada, or it's going to be a long time before they'd be willing to book Air Canada. And I think within the country of Canada, the yin and yang of it's 50% of available seat miles is it's 50% of available seat miles. You might not have a choice if you're a Canadian traveler or traveling to Canada from somewhere. But if you're an American traveler, and a lot of what Air Canada has really done over the last 5 to 7 years is build a meaningful business of passengers traveling to and from America, whether that's from Europe and Asia flying to America or from America flying around the world. They've built a really, really meaningful transfer business in Vancouver and in Toronto and in Montreal. And that's the type of passenger that has many competing sort of players that wants their business, right? Like, if you live in St. Louis, for example, right, and you're trying to go to, let's say, Frankfurt as an example, right? You obviously have Air Canada through Toronto, and they've done a really good job of pricing fares attractively, maybe helped to some extent by the weak Canadian dollar to win meaningful shares of that business. But you also can fly, United over Chicago or Dulles or
Lufthansa nonstop, actually.
well, St. Louis is a bad example because you can fly Lufthansa nonstop. But point being that, like, why would you go back to Air Canada if they just ruined your vacation plans for the summer?
Right. Exactly. And we've talked about the Canadian aviation market in the past and the major players that include WestJet, Air Transat, Porter, and how I think WestJet a few years ago became a unionized airline. When I think about labor groups, and it's interesting how you compared the national flag carrier of Air Canada to like your Thai Airways or Singapore Airlines for that matter. We don't hear a lot about labor unrest in Asian countries. There's some examples in which it can, maybe with political components involved. We haven't heard a lot of noise recently from like Qantas, for instance, although Alan Joyce, their most recent CEO, kind of ended on a sour note. And lately, we haven't been hearing a lot from Europe either. So maybe it was just Air Canada's turn. There's also, United flight attendants that also rejected the contract that was put in front of them. So it's kind of like interesting to see that both United and Air Canada are in this position where there's been tension with their labor groups.
Yeah. Well, I think the challenge is coming out of the pandemic, right? Living conditions for kind of middle income and lower middle income professionals, right? Which is where flight attendants are kind of in the overall sort of like income stack in the country, right? Have gotten meaningfully more challenging given the rising cost of housing, given inflation, given some of the underlying trends that have happened in the economy. You then pair that with there are staffing and supply and infrastructure constraints that make their jobs and their lives worse, right? And that's everything from they're probably understaffed on flight attendants relative to pre-pandemic levels, given how much flying they're doing. ATC and some of the other infrastructure challenges in the system mean that the actual act of flying is more stressful and arguably worse than it was pre-pandemic, right? Pretty much every airline has seen a meaningful drop off or decline in their sort of reliability and on-time performance. Set aside whether it's good or not in an absolute sense, it usually is worse than it was in 2019. Maintenance and delays driven by that, given parts supply constraints, have probably increased the number of flights where they're sitting there for an extra hour and a half to 2 hours at the gate, right? So there's a host of things that are making quality of life worse, paired with the fact that, you know, from a financial perspective, airlines are pretty profitable, right? Air Canada is profitable. United is profitable, right? You don't necessarily get the same level of agitation at some of the U.S. low-cost carriers who are struggling, but these are airlines that are reporting record profits and record profitability, right? In many cases. And so that combination is sort of a classic labor relations quagmire cocktail. They have a set of pretty legitimate grievances about their own lot in life and their own day-to-day work experience at work. The airline is the company or the business that they work for is profitable and spends a lot of time on investor calls talking about how things are going great. You take that combination, and this is sometimes where it ends up, right? And it's kind of the way of the world when you are a unionized airline and you have reasonably permissive labor laws and regulations the way that they do in Canada.
It's interesting that Air Canada is in the position that it's in. It may not see itself as very large. However, relative to what it does for Canada and relative to what it does for the United States, I think it's more significant than like Aeromexico. And the nature by which they compete against the big three, American, Delta, United, and now increasingly maybe a little bit Alaska, Hawaiian, for some of the long haul intercontinental traffic or traffic to and from Canada, where Air Canada kind of balances its profitability and its labor relations compared to like Delta, right? Which profitability wise does very well. They only have pilot unions. Then you have United, profitability pretty solid, in the process of having to negotiate with their flight attendants. And then you have American, which is like kind of trailing the pack, and then may have a labor relation contract that's in competitive standing. However, the profitability aspect of it is kind of missing from that picture. And so just kind of comparing where Air Canada sits in that compared to the other ones.
We got some details yesterday, not confirmed, on the tentative agreement. If you guys want to look at those, I mean, you got 4-year retroactive contract. So starting the second quarter of this year and ends in first quarter of 2029. Pay raise of 16.25%, which they say is not still less than Air Transat, small airline. 50% hourly ground pay, 60 minutes of narrow bodies, 75 for wide bodies, and increasing to 70% in the fourth year. So that's for ground staff. Gains and vacation days, sick days also. They can be cashed out for retirement. But I think we were told that flight attendants will vote on the base pay raise. So everything else is set in stone. But of course, there's some people that say that general consensus is that the raise is not enough.
Well,
But it's
okay,
going to take at least a week for operations to.
wasn't there though the desire for Air Canada to acquire Air Transat in the past, and that never went through?
I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they did sort of make an acquisition attempt to bring Air Transat into the fold, but again, because it's so much of the Canadian air travel market, you take what little competition there is, right? It's basically, Air Canada, WestJet, and a bunch of cats and dogs, and Air Transat provides some meaningful competition for holiday and leisure travelers on long haul and vacation flying within North America, really Europe and North America. So I don't know that that was ever going to be a good idea, though I suppose we just watched Korean Air and Asiana merge into a
taking like a decade.
anamorph, right? Like transformer of an airline. So who knows what some countries think. One thing I want to kind of return back to on the flight attendant contract, that was really interesting because I feel like it has become increasingly a pain point that matters a lot to flight attendants. And it's downstream of some of the infrastructure challenges that we talked about earlier, that I kind of mentioned earlier, right? Which is the notion of pre-flight pay, right? During boarding time, during time on ground, right? Sounds like that was a huge sticking point for Air Canada's flight attendants, right? From everything we've seen and heard, has been a sticking point for United's flight attendants and in other labor negotiations. I think that's actually really interesting because it's downstream of you're now spending more time on the ground. You're spending more time taxiing. You're spending more time sitting at the gate because of delays and poor ATC staffing and the first fatal air crash. And there's a lot of different factors that are causing the amount of time and the ratio of time between when flight attendants actually get paid versus how much time they spend at work. The balance of that has shifted. Very, very different world when you're on the plane for 30 minutes before departure versus an average of an hour. And sometimes it very, very easily in 20 to 40% of cases gets to an hour and a half plus, right? So I think that's actually a really, really interesting, almost like symbolic element of what's going on here, right? Is it all comes back down to, right? There's the sort of quintessential cyclical airline industry problem, which is like, sort of disciplined management creates profitable airlines. Profitable airlines create like undisciplined management structures, and undisciplined management structures create unprofitable airlines, which then triggers a set of cuts that make them profitable airlines again, which then triggers the discipline that makes like, you ever heard the quote, like, hard times create strong men, strong men create good times create weak men, weak men create like hard times, right? Like that's cyclicality, right? This is why like the airline industry has historically been viewed with tons and tons and tons of skepticism by investors and by Wall Street, right? Like, between 1978 airline deregulation and 2008, U.S. airlines as an industry cumulatively made $0 of profit. Now, since 2008, we have seen a pretty marked shift in the structural profitability of the airline industry. Some of that is consolidation. Some of that is sort of ancillary monetization. To some extent, like ancillary fees, like bag fees and things like that. But I would say, as much as anything, truthfully, credit card points and frequent flyer programs. But some of it is just the fact that they became much more disciplined relative to their revenue base, right? The first two things drove better revenue, but they also became more disciplined relative to their revenue base, in part because if you're, American Airlines, you can't play off management against America West contract and US Airways' contract and Northwest's contract and Delta's contract. It's a little bit less of there's fewer moving parts to the industry. And so it has not by no means been perfect over the last 15 years, but we were very much in a window where the US airline industry was sort of structurally and meaningfully profitable, plus or minus COVID. And now that has seemed to fall apart again. And it's fallen apart at the bottom end of the market because the legacies got really, really good at taking away the margin in sort of discount fares at the LCCs. And it's potentially under threat, at risk at the legacies or at the full service carriers if labor contracts get out of whack. And I'm not saying that's is or isn't what has happened here with Air Canada, but it is just kind of interesting to sort of think about and reflect on the cyclical nature of this industry that never seems to make money, but it's very fun.
Absolutely. I think that there have been examples that we can look to from 10 years ago where we saw the boom of US airlines, including Spirit, which we'll talk about in a little bit, making really good money. If United Airlines had its act together like it does now 10 years ago, how it would have been doing incredible things. But even American Airlines under Scott Kirby was doing fantastic stuff. And then how a lot of the other airlines in the Asia Pacific region were starting to tank. And that continued all the way through the pandemic. And a big part of that was driven by Chinese airlines, the glut of state-sponsored carriers that came into the picture, got a bunch of long-haul aircraft, were flying to places like Tijuana from Shenzhen, which still may exist, Hainan Airlines, Beijing Capital Airlines, Hong Kong Airlines, things like that. And even the low cost long haul airlines that were operating across the transatlantic region. And you had Lufthansa and Air France and KLM and creating June or Lufthansa Jump or British Airways responding to Norwegian with Level and all that. Just messiness. But now we're seeing just a much better financial stability of the Asian carriers, like black carriers like Garuda and Thai in Malaysia. They're actually making money again. Airlines in Europe, a little bit less on the margin front. They have a lot of um, they have a lot in Europe that competes against those cost carriers. So more in the single digit margins, but nevertheless profitable. And so, yeah, boom and bust is absolutely how this industry works. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't think you're ever going to see permanent financial change that will just stay that way. I mean, there are some airlines that are very good at being profitable and staying profitable, like Copa or Ryanair or Turkish Airlines, but there are others that are simply just going to have to ride the wave always. And they're so fundamentally important to the countries they serve, the economies they serve. They're not going to fail. They're also going to be just ridden with strife at any given point.
I wonder if Finnair, how it's one of those airlines that because it also depends on the circumstances, right? And so the whole Russian airspace closure, they were pivoting to North America and Canada specifically. So it's interesting what they might be thinking about right now after this whole Air Canada ordeal.
So what do we think is going to come of the Air Canada situation? Do we even know very much at this point?
I mean, I don't know. What do you think, actually? I'm actually at a loss.
I'm at a loss too, because things are weird. Things are weird right now. There is not the certainty or the sort of comfort of certainty that I felt 10 years ago about forecasting how the airline industry would perform. I felt like I was able to kind of use data from, 2011 to 2015. By the way, happy belated National Aviation Day. That's like yesterday.
Yeah.
August 19th. I was able to, I feel like, maybe make better predictions because there were more airlines. The market was, I guess, the market had more competitors. I wouldn't say the world was more stable 10 years ago in terms of like political. Well, I don't know. It's tough to say. I mean, the US is definitely in a much more tense kind of stance with a lot of countries in the world. And people are, not seeing the US in the same kind of favor that they did previously. And that includes Canada.
Yeah. Well, I think we said geopolitics has returned with a vengeance, right? On our last episodes.
And this is the first time, right, that flight attendants have done this with Air Canada. They've never experienced.
They've never
like
done a
this.
strike before?
Now the flight attendants, no.
Really?
I think it left 2011. It was some staff, but it didn't go to more than a day or so. CUPE intervened, and they actually complied. Here
Wow.
it took a day.
Do any of y'all watch South Park? Like the episode from 2008 where Canada goes on strike? It would be like interesting if they did a rendition of like Air Canada flight attendants go on strike. But yeah, like I think also it's interesting. Something comes to mind about Air Canada's flight attendants and how they were treated during the pandemic versus others in like the US, for example, who were given like furlough voluntary separation packages. I think that it was a little bit less flexible for Air Canada employees. They like effectively furloughed half of them. That said, the degree of protections that exist in Canada are not the same as they exist in the United States. It's just simply the manner by which governments and countries are structured to provide job security for people that are jobless.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I think ultimately we'll kind of have to wait and see on the fallout, right? Part of it is that precisely because planes are so full and Air Canada controls so much of the market, there's a world in which this is less impactful to them than it would be to, a carrier that is struggling more, right? Like, we're instructive looking at like, hey, what happened to Delta after their CrowdStrike induced operational challenges, meltdown, whatever you want to call it. versus what happened to Southwest after theirs, right? Like Southwest seems to have permanently taken a beating that they've never quite recovered from. And obviously Southwest's situation was way, way worse, but it will be really, really interesting to see kind of where that lands.
The Southwest beating from Wall Street?
No, that from their Christmas meltdown a couple
From their Christmas meltdown.
Yeah, holiday meltdown, right?
Southwest is also
sorry, non-denominational holiday meltdown.
Well, Southwest was a way more predictable airline 10 years ago when I first started work. When I literally moved there 10 years ago to work for them, and things were so different than they are now.
Well,
Southwest,
the IT was as predictably bad then as it is now, but that's neither here nor there.
In many ways, in fact, I think that could be a good segue to our next topic on Spirit, which is maybe Southwest is going to effectively backfill if Spirit goes out. If Spirit goes down, Southwest will capture a lot of what Spirit was capturing for Southwest. I mean, we talk about peanuts and peanut fares. That's what Spirit typified 10 years ago. That's where the basic economy response came from the major US airlines. That's where Southwest doubled down on its transparency or bundled fares product model. Although customers are smart. Every year, customers have more data, there are more websites, there are more places that they can go to, like Reddit, or find out about skiplag.com or the Points Guy or whatever, to do some digging on what transparency looks like, right? There are people, myself included, who knew that they could go to the airport and buy their Spirit Airlines tickets at the ticket counter for future flights and save $18 per ticket in internet booking fees. I mean, I've booked $25 one-way flights from Dallas to Minneapolis or from Las Vegas to Chicago for $50. And so people knew about the Spirit Airlines model, and they knew about that, I guess, Spirit culture that existed. And for a while, especially, when Bob Fornaro came on board and when Ted Christie took over as well, Spirit was running a decent operation, and, they had good on-time performance, and they were making money and also improving their customer satisfaction score.
I'm wondering who's going to take those aircraft.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to be too pessimistic. Okay, so we can talk about Spirit right after these messages from our sponsor. Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Sailing Travel eSIM. You booked your next trip, now get Sailing, the global eSIM data service. Choose your destination and plan and activate before you go. No plastic SIM cards, no phone number changes, no dodgy Wi-Fi spots, no roaming fees, just affordable mobile data wherever you are. Try Sailing Connect instantly. Get 5% off your first purchase with the code AirwaysMag5. All right, so we're back. So Spirit Airlines is facing significant financial distress publicly, right? So warning
Thanks for the understatement of the year, Helwing. Really, really descriptive.
I mean,
there.
Like we didn't know, right? No, but they need some cash. So if they don't get financing, they say they'll be out. They won't last next year. But that's I don't think they've ever said that.
I still don't really believe this is actually happening. There's a part of me that feels as if this just came out of nowhere, or it's happening, but there's no Chicken Little. Like, no one is screaming, the sky is falling, even though it's kind of halfway fallen. JetBlue and Spirit have been dealt really unlucky hands since the pandemic. JetBlue, particularly with its failed merger attempt with its Northeast Alliance.
It's hard to call that unlucky, right? Because you could have squinted at the Biden administration and understood that the new FTC regime that persisted under the Biden administration was not going to look kindly at any sort of merger, right? Good, bad, set aside your own position on it. That's just a bad reading of the tea leaves. So I reject the notion that it's purely bad luck.
Sure,
Obviously, they made a decision to go with Airbus and with Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans. There are some things in there that are not their fault, but there's a lot of bad business decisions that were made by the management teams at those two airlines to bring them to their present state.
Yeah. Well,
and the actual quote is, there's substantial doubt that about its ability to continue operating next year. I
I
mean,
mean,
but
I'm glad I
yeah, I
got rid
mean,
of all my points. Let's just say I took like
yeah, good.
6 of my friends to Puerto Rico round trip on those points.
You didn't give me any, man.
I'm
You had that
sorry,
Florida.
many Spirit points to be able to take 6 of your friends round trip to.
bro. I had a lot to get away to give away, and I remember we talked on this podcast about how like the time is running out to use them. And look,
Yeah,
say what you
I
will about
remember.
Spirit, but like the in-flight experience was perfectly fine. The flight attendants were nice. They had decent products. The seats were not comfortable, and the tray tables were small.
Yeah,
I never flew them long haul, minus my Chicago to San Juan trip, which was 4 hours each way. I don't think that I had anyone sitting in the middle seat next to me, so that helped. If Spirit were ever to be, I think, you know, quote unquote bad, it wasn't from nickel and diming. It was just like maybe operational related. But I had a hot love affair with them from like 2014 to like 2017. And then pretty much after that, I just was sitting on those miles. Oftentimes, it was actually kind of a, I don't want to say joke, but like if you worked in the airline industry, for example, and you wanted to fly non-rev, sometimes people would book a one-way Spirit flight as security, because even though like the cost of that ticket would be like $50, that would be at least a guarantee to get home. Even though maybe if they wanted to fly from Chicago to Dallas, they could do so on a Southwest flight earlier in the day, where they get an upgraded customer experience as well as be able to fly Southwest. So what beyond the gear turbofan engine issue and perhaps maybe its market expansion? It did like a salvo from Miami after the pandemic that seems to have been shuttered.
Basic economy x business model positioning.
repeat.
I think it's much, much simpler than that. I think it's literally just down to basic economy and where they choose to fly, right? So fundamentally, you look at how Spirit has organized their route network, and Frontier to a lesser extent, who's also struggling, though better capitalized and not loaded with as much debt or as rough of a pilot contract. Spirit and Frontier both grew really, really fast, some might say like weeds, by picking off discount traffic in large air travel markets. They have huge presences in places like obviously like Vegas and Orlando, your classic vacation destinations, but also in DFW and LAX and Chicago O'Hare and a bunch of other airports, right? Spirit's route network, it looks very, very, very different than it did 10, 15 years ago when they first pivoted over to the ULCC model, right? Atlantic City and Myrtle Beach and those types of airports are not the core of what Spirit circa 2023 or even 2025 is flying. And for a while, they were able to pick off sort of travelers from the full service, the legacy carriers, because they offered deeply discounted sort of sticker fares that they then monetized by layering on ancillary fees on top, right? The quintessential ULCC model that still is working really well, by the way, for airlines like Ryanair and AirAsia. And AirAsia is pretty nice for ULCC, but still ULCC in an Asian context, and EasyJet, right? And Indigo for that matter. Though I guess they just added business class, so who knows what's old is new again.
Yeah, I think Indigo is honestly playing with fire.
Let's go ahead and sidebar that non sequitur so I can finish my point about
That is
business
going to be
class,
another topic for another day.
which is that the US legacy carriers kind of took it lying down for a while. They let the sort of back of the bus economy class traffic that was searching for the cheapest fare writ large essentially escaped. They leaked away to Spirit, right? Given a choice, most passengers would choose United over Spirit at the same fare with the same restrictions. Most passengers would certainly choose Delta over Spirit at the same fare, even with the same restrictions. It just wasn't profitable for those airlines to offer those fares when they had a more full service economy class product as their entry point tier, right? Or their entry price tier. With the advent of basic economy, the legacies got really, really good at competing with, Spirit and Frontier in their markets. Nowadays, American can capture the 10 to 15% of highest fare Frontier passengers, the ones that drive profitability on that airplane via basic economy, given the loyalty, given the lock-in, given the slightly better passenger experience, and so on and so forth. And that meant that they no longer had the pricing advantage that drove their entire business, because the listed fare in Google Flights or any online travel agency was match. Now, when you click in and you're like, well, do I want to select a seat? Okay, well, great. You might as well upgrade from basic economy to economy or to main cabin. Sorry, main cabin. My bad. Economy. And in practice, the majority of passengers don't pay that basic economy fare, but it removed their ability to win enough business to fill their planes. So I think that was like a really, really big piece of the puzzle. It fundamentally was a broken business model. Now, the one ULCC in the US that has escaped this fate, right? They've had their own challenges, is Allegiant, because Allegiant flies almost a true Ryanair ULCC style model.
Secondary,
they operate
tertiary.
out of secondary and tertiary airports. They basically are plugging the gaps and flying markets that the legacies that aren't big enough for the legacies, that aren't big enough for the full service carriers, that are point-to-point routes. That's very different than offering 2 daily flights from Dallas to Cleveland, which if I remember correctly, Frontier did at one point, right? That's a route that American Airlines is going to eat your lunch on if it has the ability to match your advertised fare. Punta Gorda to, Peoria, like, I don't know if Allegiant flies that route, but it sounds like a route that Allegiant would fly off the top of my head. That's not a route that any of the U.S. legacies are ever going to.
Breeze or Avelo may fly that. I don't know.
Breeze or Avelo might fly that, and relatively speaking, they're obviously earlier in their growth curve. They're still kind of going through that startup phase, but they're even doing better than Spirit seems to be right now, or Frontier. So I think it's as simple as that. Business model, route network. I mean, I suppose route network is a piece of this, in that they chose to compete with the legacies in legacy hubs and legacy markets. But a lot of this just comes down to the U.S. majors got better at competing with Spirit and Frontier. And if they can't be the lowest advertised fare in a market, they're not going to win enough business to fill their planes. Sometimes it's as simple as that.
They saw how they operated and were like, okay.
I also always wonder if it's one of those things that just comes down to when airlines are started or how they're led by a certain leader with a vision and what they create and what they see and how people kind of fall in line with that. Ben Baldanza for Spirit, industry veteran, rest in power. He really didn't even like traveling. He didn't see Spirit Airlines as an airline. He saw it as a transport company that ran on a low cost model, no frills, completely unbundled, high penalties if you didn't follow the rules, and also not cutting corners, but really going bargain basement with some of the fundamentals that got put in place, like IT or, a couple other things, I think. He made the airline very profitable. He made a lot of, people very happy in terms of helping to build its success. When Bob Fornaro came in, he had an AirTran background, I think, and AirTran was also kind of a little engine that could, of the carcass of ValueJet and being able to continue forth with the low-cost model until Southwest absorbed it. And then you had Ted Christie, and he was the one that led Spirit to where it most recently went, which was a potential union with JetBlue. But the JetBlue and Spirit union came about after Spirit and Frontier, which in my opinion made more sense from the very beginning. Those two had always been talking about each other, and they also seem to have a lot more in common with their complementary fleet type as well as their existing model. I mean, there's so much divergence from what JetBlue does than from what Spirit does, but not as much from what Frontier and from what Spirit does. Nevertheless, Frontier has Indigo Partners involved. Indigo Partners isn't just about Frontier. Indigo Partners is about a lot of different airlines, and maybe it just didn't want to touch what Spirit has, or perhaps, and I don't want to say this with any sort of confidence, but if it sees Spirit as a liquidated carrier getting its assets, as opposed to when it's not liquidated.
So like what you're saying is like, you're saying like JetBlue, Frontier aircraft, basically. Yeah. And maybe
Pilots.
some country,
Flight attendant.
Allegiant would do some horse bids for routes. Yeah.
And I say that with a note of sadness. Like, I hate an airline going out of business.
Yeah, of course.
It's saddening. However, like, people don't seem to be very sad. Like, I guess the reactions from like the news sites are like, oh, airfares are going to go up. And I'm like, it's just another merger, or it's just one, like, and
Well, the interesting thing is like, it's not like there's that many assets, right? Like, you got the planes and you got the order book with Airbus, which is, I suppose, useful which actually is really useful given how hard
slots.
Not that many slots, right? Like
LaGuardia and Newark are valuable. I don't know if
Newark,
do they
kind of. Newark's slots are.
It's a little bit opaque. Newark,
yeah, it's a slightly different level. Like JFK and LaGuardia are the meaningful slots, and it's not that many, right? It's like double digits worth of slot pairs, right? It's gates at a couple of places, like Chicago O'Hare, though that's administered centrally by the airport authority. So who knows how those gates get moved around.
And the gate roulette at O'Hare right now has everyone's panties in a knot.
Yeah, well, it specifically has the airline that you have on your T-shirt's panties in a knot because they basically didn't pay attention to Chicago for a decade, and all of a sudden we're like, "Whoa, United is getting more gates than us. That's unfair." Well, okay, well you should have flown more than a skeleton crew. Anyway, neither here nor there. But really, what it boils down to is FLL. FLL is actually the crown jewel. Right, the planes and the order book, right? Those will just get partitioned off to the highest bidder. Airbus will happily take those back because it can sell them 7 times over. And there's different kind of variations there. The FLL hub is the most valuable piece, and in particular, it's valuable to JetBlue. Maybe valuable to United in the theoretical world where United wants to do, to build a South Florida hub, which it's kicked the tires on at least over the last year and a half. So I think what this comes down to is, can JetBlue pull together the muscle to actually make a bid for FLL, and does United get involved, if at all?
Well, and yeah, that's going to be one to watch because Southwest has kind of stepped back from JetBlue. I don't think that the showdown between JetBlue, Spirit, and Southwest at Fort Lauderdale had a clear winner ever. But if there were to ever be a winner that wants to influence another airline to get what it wants in South Florida and that needs it, it would be United with Blue Sky.
Well, and I think like a lot of people have looked at the tea leaves and said, hey, Blue Sky and this Spirit thing conveniently popping up might just be sort of a move towards an end game where United takes over portions of JetBlue or even all of JetBlue.
Right.
Which would be really interesting, right? Because the notion of a United JetBlue merger, right? Like, well, what are you really solving for? Like, FLL is sort of valuable. Does United really want to get into a battle with Delta at Boston? Maybe, but okay. Let's stipulate that that's, I guess, workable. FLL, there's no world in which it gets allowed to keep JFK in this scenario, right? Okay, but JFK is 45% of JetBlue's capacity, so you're really buying half an airline.
Sure. I mean, I also don't think that JetBlue has completely
thrown in the towel.
Well, also their Boston, New York strategy seemed to make more sense 5-10 years ago, and now it's like either they've been burned or like.
Well, I think they let Delta encroach too aggressively into their turf.
Unlike Alaska, for example, that like doubled.
Alaska fought back, and I think that the challenge for JetBlue was you've got a couple of different moving parts there, right? But they threw a bunch of airplanes at like Newark to Los Angeles during the pandemic with Mints, right? Like, what are you doing? Boston was you had meaningful play in Boston. You had with the advent of Mint plus transatlantic, the ability to really start to win over Boston as a market. And instead they let Delta come in and not eat their lunch. But in Alaska, Delta isn't quite running away with their tail between their legs, but it's also not exactly putting up an even fight, right? Right. Done a lot of rounds with Alaska, and Alaska seems to be winning. And JetBlue could have maybe pulled something off like that in Boston. especially given that it had the reputation as a nice, friendly carrier with good service and snacks. And admittedly, part of the challenge was that like it was definitely JetBlue's worst product. It was like, it was the E190, right? Boston's was at one point a very, very E190 heavy hub.
market. Yeah.
And that side by side with Delta's, fleet and Delta's.
I mean, you also have to remember that JetBlue, JFK is going to, inaugurate new terminals. JetBlue CEO was attended at the Terminal 6 team. Yeah, I mean,
It's a really good
they're
point,
looking at their home and they're like,
yeah, I think as we zoom out, like, in spite of all the noise that we hear about like delays and strikes and everyone complaining about such and so forth, there's actually a lot happening underneath the surface or actually in front of our faces in the US airline industry right now. I mean, we talked about Canada, but like, look at what's happening here. Alaska, Hawaii, JetBlue, and its, Blue Forward, is that what it was called? Plan, but now it's like Sky Blue with United. Spirit, obviously, Southwest and all its evolutions. I think Allegiant and Sun Country are kind of chilling. Frontier, maybe the same. American is just glad to finally have 7-8Ps, but a lot of them are also like going through teething issues. And then you have Delta. Delta just doesn't really get deeply involved in all the drama, but at the same time, I wonder what Delta might do that could be considered bold, or is that boldness still there for Delta, you know, in the next 18 to 24 months?
well, I mean, in relation to Spirit, I don't know, not much.
Yeah.
So, the thing that I was thinking about was, you have a new administration and not to go political, but I don't even think that the market any type of merger or just consolidation, I don't know if that's going to happen either, regardless of.
Well, if Spirit ends up in Chapter 7, right? Like if they end up in receivership, then you're just buying assets at that point. And that's discrete from a merger, a more traditional merger of equals or merger of businesses, right? So, I mean, on some level, right? Like, if they were to block basically United, which implicitly blocks Delta and American from buying Spirit's assets, Freudian slip there, I suppose. Or if they were to block, JetBlue from buying Spirit's assets, who's going to buy them at that point, right? On some level, you're literally like essentially saying, hey, set all these assets on fire. And I think like that's like a slightly different sort of valence, and there's slightly less antitrust governance that sits over something like that. Right. Now, the question is, will JetBlue end up in Chapter 7? Sorry, again, Freudian slip. Will Spirit end up in Chapter 7? I think the answer is unclear, but I think they're maybe also posturing to try and get someone to offer to buy them before they get to Chapter 7 so that they get a better end outcome. And that might be part of what's happening.
And how do you see Sun Country in all of this? Like, can they benefit from anything?
Not really, because they're just so localized to Minneapolis, right? Like they're a niche airline and they serve that niche really, really well, which is flying Minnesotans to the sun and charters, right? Like that's really what
they're happy with their operation.
They're happy with their operation. It's small. They don't get above their, they don't get too big for their britches, so to speak. Delta, for whatever reason, seems to tolerate their coexistence in Minneapolis. And, and actually, interestingly, one of the, like I said, I don't think what Spirit did with its network or didn't do with its network really ultimately mattered, other than maybe the cumulative set of what they were doing with their network. But it is interesting to note that in the last couple of years, Spirit has quietly rebuilt Detroit, which was once their hometown and hub. Like they started as a Detroit-based airline, almost like Sun Country, but they quickly kind of expanded and did a lot of different things around the U.S. There was like a bit of poetic, like, oh, we're going back to our roots. Didn't work, but there was that sort of like poetic sort of memory in their Detroit buildup. And I say now drawdown because it looks like they are rebuilding Fort Lauderdale with an eye towards making it the most sellable asset possible.
Well, interesting, because we had like an earnings episode that we didn't do, but then,
Yeah, I mean,
Canada and Spirit suddenly
earnings
took off with
to me
news.
are going to be interesting for Q3. I think that is going to be worth talking about. We've had kind of now 6 to 9 months of normalization post changeover in administration that will affect how airlines are going to be forecasting capacity for the future, how they are going to be determining where they put their capacity, how the environment, corporate, leisure, etc., feels about the travel market, about demand. If there's a drop in business demand, is the leisure travel demand that is now kind of helping going to have a sustained effect? What's going to happen with the model evolutions of Southwest and its impacts? I mean, Southwest used to have the upper hand on dictating the outcomes of these financial results. And it was around this time 10 years ago when Delta took the crown from it. And actually, Southwest didn't really hit and fire on all cylinders for the years leading up to the pandemic. Industry analysts were crowing Delta. Like, they were just singing their praises, talking about how United was underperforming, but then that switched with American. But really, they also kept calling out about how Southwest was just kind of sitting on its laurels. It was literally doing the exact thing that Herb Kelleher said not to do. Sit on your laurels, you get a thorn in your A. That's how Southwest became, in my opinion, kind of arrogant about its product, its people, technology, brand recognition, and reliability.
Specifically, the technology is maybe the most unjustified arrogance that has ever existed.
Yeah.
Maybe at any company ever,
that
but
works in their
especially
technology department.
Ever. No, yes. That's
Yeah. I mean, like, at some point you're just kind of like, I feel like I am having to explain my relationship with this employer and this company in my role, separating myself. Like, Southwest almost encouraged people to not separate themselves, their identity, from Southwest Airlines if they were an employee. And I'm like, that's
Look,
not healthy. It's really
well,
unhealthy.
it's interesting, right? Like, I think that like the most durable, successful companies oftentimes do have that sort of like quasi cult like aspect to them, right? You talk to some people that work at J&J that are J&J lifers, and they'll quote the credo to you over a drink at a bar, right? Like good companies have that property to them. In Southwest case, it was the gold standard for the U.S. airline industry for a very, very long time, but it no longer is.
Yeah. And so it's why I kind of point to always, the fish thinks from the head, or the leader with the vision is the one that kind of helps, take control. Like, Iberia is an example of an airline that's turned itself around. Japan Airlines turned itself around. And then you have others that like seem to never be able to get, the kind of leader that
Well,
they
it's
need.
hard to turn yourself around until you get pushed to the brink. And now the really interesting question is, like, several U.S. airlines have been pushed to varying degrees to the brink over the last, 3-4 years post-pandemic. It'll be interesting to see, what was the line? Hard times create strong airlines. Strong airlines create good times create
weak.
weak airlines. Weak airlines create
Complacent.
hard
Yeah.
times. Hard times create good airlines, right? Bringing everything full circle. Well,
All right, guys.
it has been an interesting moment in the airline industry, as it always is.
And this
Glad
is
I got
kind
to
of a
chat
nice,
about it with you guys.
yeah. And this is kind of a nice little touch-up tune-up to where the state of affairs lie, at least in the North America region, going into the fall period. Last episode, we covered global stuff. This one was a little bit more focused on the homeland.
Yeah.
As always, time will tell. Can we
And
do
the
a little
sailing.
fun share and tell about like upcoming trips we have? Upcoming trips we have. Like, I just checked in on a flight to DC, Dulles, an airport I've been flying into a lot lately. My brother's getting married this weekend. Small wedding, big wedding will be like next year. In Virginia, I flying in to IAD, and I think that there's a lot of interesting things in Dulles Airport. I find it kind of quirky. Good lounges. The United Terminal gets a lot of heat, but like there's a really interesting late evening bank. If you like flying to Dulles late at night, you'll see like a huge bank to like Europe and Sao Paulo and other Africa. Yeah. And then if my India plans still transpire, Air Canada, I'm taking there. I'm taking Etihad back, and then it's kind of all I have. What about you all?
Think I have Art Basel, Miami. I do have a trip to Washington, but I'm not sure. From New York, what should I take? The train?
From to Washington? Well, it depends on where you're going in the DC area.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of the train because theoretically you can be productive, but in practice the Wi-Fi is slow that you can't actually be productive. It's, I suppose, nice to look at the scenery for like an hour, but I feel like, you know, in a on a flight, you can be productive until 17 minutes before departure because you do have to board 15 minutes before departure. And in the air, honestly, the Wi-Fi is better than Amtrak unless you're on a regional jet. And then when you're on the ground, you're back out again. So I tend to be planes until I tend to be planes unless it's Europe and it's high speed rail and it's very, very specific.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, of course, planes. And I see more airlines adopting Starlink, by the way.
Yeah, I'm excited for United to have Starlink because that will be kind of the last productivity frontier. I mean, I will say that I've been flying a lot of Delta this year, like a lot more than I normally would. Plenty of American, plenty of United, as always, right? I was 1K and exec platinum last year. Added diamond medallion to my like Thanos rings this year, so it's been interesting. Delta, the thing is like I kind of get it, right? Like as much as I don't want to, as much as I'm like sort of like there's like United loyalty like sort of seeped into my blood, like Delta, objectively, the planes are nice, the planes are pretty. Like I understand why people fly them. The loyalty program still offends me on an intellectual level, but like I get it. My upcoming travel is I'm going to London in a couple of days, actually. I'm flying United out, American, actually British Airways back in, booked through American. And then I'm going to, I mean, I have a bunch of domestic business travel. That's just like a standard backdrop. I'm going to Hartford next week. That's sort of almost a sidebar. But then I'm going to Europe and Greece for a wedding in September. So I'm very excited for that.
Very cool.
No new airlines, though. I just really fly United, American, Delta, British Airways, occasionally Alaska or JetBlue if I can get away with it.
I've been adding a
Enjoy
few.
them,
I
though.
mean, I have a list of airlines I want to fly before I die. So yeah, no one really cares about that except for me. Great.
They do.
Thanks, y'all, for a wonderful time. It was great chatting with you as always. Any other things you want to say before we sign off?
Well, hopefully you're glad that we're back. Remember to leave us a review or a rating at your favorite podcast app of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you know, a hacked RSS feed on a Linux server, you name it.
Yes. And if you want to see Rohan eat, we are also on YouTube. And we begin nice views. You know, it was the first episode. I think there was one a couple of years ago. I'm not sure. I think it was just audio. But now we're going to put more videos on YouTube because, yeah, you can also comment on.
Sorry for my uncouth eating
there.
habit.
That's okay.
Well, I mean, hey, at the end of the day, it's not like the food has gotten better on airplanes. So you might as well be good to eat yummy food while you're talking about airplanes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All right.
We gotta have the gourmet people back on the talk.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice night.
On the next episode of the Airways podcast.
Tip of the cap.